Burkina Faso's military has taken power in a coup just weeks before an election, but it's not the first African country to experience a military takeover. So why are coups so common in some parts of Africa, and what can governments do to stop them? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Foliba Thibault. When Burkina Faso's military intervened to overthrow longtime President Blaise Compaoré last October, it was seen by some as a good coup. Compaoré was about to try and extend his 27-year rule, and the people had said they'd had enough. But almost a year later, and in a sign of just how fragile the political process is, the Presidential Guard, still loyal to Compaoré, conducted another coup. It arrested the interim president and prime minister and dissolved the parliament. This all just a few weeks before elections that were meant to put Burkina Faso back on the road to democracy. Now, of course, Burkina Faso is not an exception in Africa. The continent has seen at least 200 successful or failed coups since the 1960s. Some thought it had begun to shake off its reputation for military takeovers. But in just the last 5 years, there have been coups in Niger, as well as Mali and Guinea-Bissau in 2012, and Central African Republic a year later. There was also an attempted coup in Gambia last year and in Burundi earlier this year. So why do military takeovers seem so common in Africa? Let's bring in our guests for today's Inside Story. In Pretoria, South Africa, we have David Zumeu, senior researcher at the South African Institute for Security Studies. In London, Gabriel Leon, lecturer in political economy at King's College London. Gabriel specializes in military coups and their causes. And in Paris, France, we have Cynthia Ohayon, West Africa analyst for the International Crisis Group. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being with us on Inside Story today. If I can start with you, David, in South Africa, a very confusing political situation in Burkina Faso today. But the turn of events are not surprising at all, are they? This was predictable.
No, definitely this was predictable. I will even say this is of the Act 2 of what began last year when Compaoré was compared to a Sikh exile in Côte d'Ivoire. We see how quick the military element moved to recuperate the process. As we see how Yakuba Zida, who was the number 2 of the Presidential Guard, was propelled before the scene to take control of the transition before the international pressure forced him to back down and to allow Kafando to become a civilian president to lead the transition. But the response of the military comes as a resistance to some of the reforms that the transitional government was putting in place that will ultimately weaken the capacity of the military forces in Burkina Faso to remain control of the political process. So
you're saying that the military felt threatened. Cynthia, in Paris, the Presidential Guard unit that dissolved the transitional government was formed under President Blaise Compaoré. Do you think he has a hand in the events of the last few hours in Burkina Faso?
Well, I mean, this is a very hard question to answer, and I don't think we can provide a clear answer. I'm not sure that he would be directly involved in what is going on, but what is sure is that his entourage, his associates, including those that are still in Ouagadougou, are obviously playing a role in this. I think, there is a kind of collusion between at least a segment of the CDP, which is the former ruling party, and the RSP, to get together and preserve their interests, their common interests.
Gabriel, do you think the events in Burkina Faso, the events that we've seen in the last few hours, are similar to what happened last year, the popular revolt that led to the ouster of the former president, Blaise Compaoré? Are we in a similar situation, in your opinion?
No, I don't think so. I think what's happened is that you have a presidential guard that about a year ago was very powerful, had a lot of perks and enjoyed a lot of benefits, and they're basically being threatened with disbandment. So essentially, I think they're just reacting to the existential threat that they're facing, because, I mean, the truth is that the next democratic government that would have been elected in October would probably have gotten rid of the presidential guard. So I think they're acting essentially in defense of their own interests.
You speak of an existential threat that they felt in Burkina Faso, Gabriel. of course, every coup d'etat has different origins, causes, and effects. What are the underlying causes in most cases when you talk about Burkina Faso, Mali, and so on? What are the motivations for the army to take power?
Yeah, in general, one of the most striking commonalities across coups is that they have to do with the basically military protecting its own corporate interest. So if you look at the data, going back to the 1960s, actually, one of the things that is quite striking is that when a government decreases the amount of money that is being allocated to the military, the probability of that government being overthrown in a coup increases considerably. I think in that way, what's happened in Burkina Faso now is essentially just another instance of that. The military is basically facing some threats to its own interests, and it's reacting to that threat. So I think there are a lot of commonalities with a lot of other coups in Africa.
David, what about the idea that the military also in some cases takes over because they represent the people's concern? Is that the case in Burkina Faso, or can you give us an example where that's been the case? The military took over because the people wanted them to step in.
Yes, definitely. The involvement of military in politics has never been a good thing for the continent. It's always led to disaster, be it good or bad. But at a certain point where civilian presidents behave themselves to compromise the political process or compromise the stability of the country, military institution becomes almost a safeguard for the preservation of what has been there. We look at the Niger in 2010, the intervention of the military to stop Mamadou Tanja from amending the constitution and drag his country into instability was seen as a good coup, because after the coup, I think the military officers surrendered the power to a civilian government, organized a transition. And this was not the first time this had happened. In 1999, the army in Niger also intervened, to the extent that that army in Niger has gained a reputation of the one who restores a democratic experiment in Niger. But elsewhere, in the case of Burkina Faso, the army has always been, one, the backbone of the political oppression under President Compaoré for almost 30 years, and has not really accepted the fact that popular upheaval managed to really chase Compaoré out of power, and now facing the threat of dismissal by the authorities of the traditional government. They think they need to react to protect their own interests. So we have two cases where the army intervened to defend its peculiar interests, while in the other case of Niger, we see the army intervening to make sure that the democratic credentials of Niger remain on track.
Do you agree, Cynthia, with David when he says that in Burkina Faso today, that the army, this is essentially what he said, the army doesn't really represent the people's concerns? I mean, what's the relationship between the military and the people who took to the streets last year to demand the ouster of Blaise Compaoré?
Yes, absolutely. There is at the moment, I mean, the military that is taking over the country does not have popular support. Quite the contrary, the people are mobilizing, or at least trying to mobilize to counter the coup. And what happened last year is that the military sort of presented its intervention as helping the interests of the people, but really the military, and in particular the current Prime Minister Yacouba Isaac Zida, who was the second in command of the RSP, he was put in power by the former regime to make sure that someone was in power to preserve their interests. So really, I mean, and then he kind of colluded with some segments of civil society to pretend that he was going to safeguard the uprising. And then he emancipated himself. But really, when the army took over in October of last year, it was really to preserve the interest, its own interests and the interests of the former regime. And that's what it's doing again now.
We've heard that labor unions, Cynthia, in Burkina Faso and civil society organizations such as Le Ballet Citoyen call for general protests and a strike. Do you think they'll be able to gather this time around? Will they be able to take to the streets like they did last year?
I think the military and the RSP and those who are organizing the coup, I think they were very well prepared for this. I mean, this is a reaction from civil society that was to be expected, and I'm hearing that the RSP is patrolling Ouagadougou, and they are trying to disperse demonstrators. So to be honest, I am not sure that people will be able to mobilize in great numbers, and they might be simply scared to get to the streets. I mean, I know that leaders from civil society and even from political parties are very mobilized, and some of them are not afraid to go down to the streets. But I am not sure that they will be able to gather great numbers so as to put enough pressure on the RSP.
The context is very different this time around than you say. Gabriel, I want to get your opinion on a point that David made just a second ago. He talked about a good coup. My question is, what makes a coup a good coup? And, you know, in opposition, what makes it a bad coup?
Yes, I think that's a very good point. You need to think about who is being overthrown and who comes afterwards. So if you have a coup that removes from power a dictator who's not very good to his population and then leads to a process that will conclude in democracy, I think that would be considered a good coup. A coup, on the other hand, that is against the democracy and then you end up with a dictatorship, that would be a bad coup. And I think the thing to bear in mind is that when you have a dictator who's quite powerful, it's very difficult to remove that person from office in any way other than through a coup.
So when we hear today condemnation from the United Nations, from France, condemnation at the events that are happening in Burkina Faso, and when you compare that to the reaction last year, which was a bit more, they were, if not applauding what happened in Burkina Faso, they certainly weren't condemning it. How do you explain this difference in reaction from the international community?
Well, I think the difference is explained by the fact that we view democracy as sort of the ideal political system, and for very good reasons. And I think the coup last year was seen as a step, or a necessary step perhaps, in the direction of democracy. And I think the elections that were going to happen in a few weeks' time was sort of a next step in that trajectory towards democracy. And what's happened now is that the coup that we've had is actually pushing us out of that trajectory, or away from that trajectory. So it's actually pushing us in the opposite direction of where we think the country should be traveling.
David, in Pretoria, I want to ask you about the reaction of the regional bodies, the African Union, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS.
I think the reaction has come on it was timely. I think since this morning, I think the three organizations, ECOWAS, African Union and the UN, have issued a joint communique condemning what was happening in Burkina Faso. And after the proclamation of what they said is a new republic, the African Union issued an immediate communique, said that everything happening, or every decision taking the military junta will not be considered. And then the next step from African Union and ECOWAS will be how to impose a sanction on those who are now ruining the hope of a democratization, the completion of the transition in Burkina Faso, because the elections are only planned to take place in 3 weeks, and the campaign was supposed to start on Saturday. So this came to disrupt all the effort that the AU, ECOWAS and the UN as well as the European Union put into the transition of Burkina Faso to see Burkina Faso return to political normalcy. And I think the reaction so far is appreciated for the kind of tough language that all those organizations have adopted so far. But there is also a door to engage those who are in power to see how to take into consideration some of the grievances that might have led them to put a stop to the transition in Burkina Faso.
Now, I want to get your view on another aspect now. An increasing number of African leaders are trying to defy constitutional limits on their time in office. It's what some are calling third-termism. Now, since the year 2000, 15 African leaders have tried to remain in power by changing their constitutions. Burundi's President Pierre Nkurunziza is the most recent. He was re-elected in July despite weeks of protests and a constitutional limit of 2 terms in office. Others to watch are the Democratic Republic of Congo, Congo-Brazzaville and Rwanda, all countries whose leaders are suspected of wanting to run for a 3rd term. Gabriel, I want to get your view on this. Do you think these maneuvers to stay in power could be considered a form of coup as well?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't call it a form of coup, because I think when we think of coups, we generally think that the military needs to be involved. But I think the, again, sort of very concerning developments because, again, they push you away from that trajectory that is meant to take you towards democracy. I think it's something, actually, there's a very interesting parallels with Latin America. Latin America experienced something quite similar back in sort of late 1990s and early 2000s, where you had all of these democratically elected presidents actually extending the terms. So they were becoming presidents for life, which in a way was kind of sort of undermining the spirit of democracy. And I think in a way that's what's currently happening in Africa.
Cynthia, in Paris, what about the foreign influences, the former colonial powers like France, for instance? What role can they play in reducing the risk of coups in African countries, in perhaps convincing these leaders not to run for a third term? Is there still, do you think there's still a possibility that these former colonial powers can influence what's happening on the African continent?
They have an important role to play, indeed. The most important leverage that they have, especially in the case of Burkina Faso, is international aid. Burkina Faso is very dependent on international aid. Basically, the state cannot function or cannot function properly without aid. And I mean, I think this stick worked pretty well last year. There was a lot of international pressure when Lieutenant Colonel Zida seized power. There was a lot of pressure that eventually made him give power back to a civilian to lead the transition. So I think this is one card that the international community has to play. And hopefully they will play this card, and this will, have an impact in the negotiations that will have to start at some point to find a way out of the situation. But the sure thing is that the foreign players also have their own interests to preserve, and Burkina Faso is in a very strategic location, so that also, comes into consideration.
David, she made an interesting point there, Cynthia, when she said that foreign powers have interests in these countries. Does that mean that some of these foreign powers, like France, for instance, have also had a hand in what's happened in these military coups?
Look, if you look at it from the 1960s, definitely France has made and unmade, so to speak, regimes in Africa, including Burkina Faso. When they are not happy with the regime that is in place, it's definitely behind the scene, work out to topple that government. But the things have changed a little bit since the democratization process, when some social forces, civil society organizations, and activists have taken control of the political process. Even though in Burkina Faso has been extremely difficult, we have seen very important activities carried out by civil society organizations that has helped Blaise Compaoré to relinquish control over some element of power and show some kind of respect to human rights. Of course, his regime is still marked with some assassination, including Noble Zongo, but also the unresolved case of Thomas Sankara, for which justice has never been rendered. So foreign influence can work both ways to maintain a regime that is favorable to them, but also to stop the one that want to hang on to power against the interests of a citizen.
You talked about France and Blaise Compaoré. Blaise Compaoré, of course, for a long time was supported by the former colonial power, France. Gabriel, in London, do you agree with David when he says that things have changed, that the foreign influence isn't as strong today as it was in the past?
Yes, I agree. I think a lot of the foreign influence in the past was motivated by the Cold War. So after 1989, the foreign powers had less of an incentive to intervene. And actually, I would personally be quite wary of suggesting that foreign powers should get involved in some of these issues, because I think that when the military intervenes, they often try to find reasons for doing so. And there's no reason that comes easier than saying, oh, well, the opposition is being supported by a foreign power, and us as the military have to look after the interest of our nation. So I think that international involvement in these negotiations has to be done very carefully.
But there was a time when, just in the last few years, there was hope that, this was over. that we wouldn't see as many military coups in Africa, on the African continent, not as many certainly as in the 1980s and early 90s. But it seemed to have picked up again in just the last 5 years. How do you explain this, Gabriel?
Well, I mean, I think the economic crisis probably has a lot to do with it, because going back to the idea that the military actually looks after its own interests, when the economy is not doing very well, the government has less money to give out, which means less money is going to the military. And then the military gets upset and then tries to overthrow the government. And by taking control of the government, then they have control over the whole pie. And I think that's one of the reasons. And the second reason has to do with the war on terror, which I think has now become sort of more relevant in Africa over the last few years, which means that the military is again playing a more prominent role in politics, which makes them perhaps think, well, this is our chance to take over.
So, Cynthia, what do you think then could deter these coups? I mean, do you think more government spending on the military could help deter these coups?
Well, I mean, I think that in the long term, at some point, the governments will have to find ways to rein in the military. I mean, in Burkina Faso, for example, it's a characteristic of its political history that the military has always intervened whenever there was a problem between civilian politicians. And so, I mean, in the long term, ideally, we should be able to make sure that the military stays with the barracks and to dissociate military issues and political issues. So, I mean, I'm not sure that just increasing spending just to make military soldiers happy is a solution. But I think this is an issue that is demilitarizing political life. For example, in Burkina Faso, is an issue that is going to take some time. And I mean, you would think that an old-style coup like what is happening right now is not possible anymore because of all the international pressure. But clearly, it's still possible.
So there's still a lot of challenges. Do you agree with Cynthia, David in Pretoria, that there's a long way to go before we see less of these military coups in Africa? And also, what do you think can effectively be done to reduce the risk of coups in these countries?
No, definitely. I think if we look at it, you mentioned it in the introduction, from 1960s up to 2000, we record that almost, according to the statistic that I used recently in the paper, almost 80 coups, successful coups, I mean, and from 2000 we have 8. So you have now, if you add Burkina Faso, 89 successful coups that have taken place. But if you look at over the past 10 years, probably because of a normative framework that has been established by the African Union in its African Charter on Democracy and Good Governance, the Article 24 and to 26 made it clear it's difficult for a coup to be successful in Africa or coup leaders to hang on to power. They're not allowed to even lead the transition, and that has recorded some success. With ECOWAS as well, you look at the protocol, the 2001 additional protocol on democracy and good governance, they have been very specific in limiting or making life difficult for coup makers. Sanogo in Mali and Dadis Camara in Guinea-Conakry could not really survive the international pressure. So these in Guinea. So these are some of the elements in addition to the effort by civil society to hold government accountable and to force them to make sure that democracy is implemented and the institutions are consolidated to really deprive the military from the argument that they generally use to stage coups.
Gabriel, you have the last word. What do you think can be done to reduce the risk of coups in some parts of Africa?
Well, I mean, I agree with David. I think building civil society is the way to go. And the reason for that is that in many African countries, when you go back 10, 20 years, the military was actually the one organization that could coordinate and act in a sort of organized manner. And I think creating other types of organizations that can function in a similar way and in a way act as a balancing power to the military is the way to go.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll leave it on that. Thank you so much for an interesting discussion. David Zumeu, Gabriel Leon, and Cynthia Ohayon. Thank you very much for watching as well. As always, you can contact us by going to our program page on our website, aljazeera.com. You can also leave a comment on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or tweet us AJ Inside Story. From me, Fuli Batibo, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.